But this is part 2 of the Milgram experiment and how it ties in with the whole hierarchy structure we've been living under for centuries. So I'm just going to start playing a little bit of the last part of it, just to recap, refresh your memory, and then I'm going to elaborate.
People not knowing much about the experiment claim that subjects who go to the end of the board are sadistic. Nothing could be more foolish as an overall characterization of these persons. The context of their action must always be considered. The individual, upon entering the laboratory, becomes integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum.
Okay, so that statement's really important when he says that the individual gets carried away with the situation's own momentum. So a quick way to sort of elaborate on that is, imagine like a pub crawl with a bunch of blokes, and you've always got your 1 or 2 dominant ones, and the rest will just generally fall in because they have this fear of their needs for belonging, acceptance. They require others to validate that for them, and it's usually the more dominant ones. If they can get their approval, then they have that belief or experience of some kind of worthiness. So they'll do what's required in order to stay within the comfort of that space, and very few times will they step out of it. That's that kind of momentum that gets built. So that's how it's done. And just like being polite as well, like if you saw in the earlier video, he was making comment about, he doesn't want to be rude or anything. So that thing that's trained into us about politeness is like a virtue almost. That's a sacred thing. You don't cross that line. That's another control structure that's been put on us that we've obviously absorbed and we pass into our children. So anyway, I'll continue finishing it off.
The results, as I observe them in the laboratory, are disturbing. They raise the possibility that human nature cannot be counted on to insulate men from brutality and inhumane treatment at the direction of malevolent authority.
See, this I actually disagree with. I disagree that it's human nature. I actually would like to put in another flag, I guess, another perspective, and that is that we are adaptive to the conditions that are there before us. And if the conditions for us are there that we require to compete with each other for our own survival, then that's what we'll do, because our primary goal is survival. That's an instinctual thing. And so if the conditions are placed that way, then we will react in accordance with those conditions. So with that statement, I actually disagree, that it's not human nature, it's the conditions that we're presented with.
A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. If in this study, an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.
Well, we don't need to wonder, do we? Because we're living it. So let me just bring out that domination hierarchy model. This one. So as he said, like government with its prestige, so that's all an illusion. So just like, a perception of legitimate authority. This whole structure is all there because there's a perception that it's legitimate. And how is that done, right? So let's look at this one. This is through very deliberate education, and status is another word for a politician. One who holds the erroneous belief that there is such a thing as authority vested in certain people, magically giving them the right to rule over other people. This authority means that a certain collective of people who we call government have the moral right to issue commands to those whom they rule, those under their jurisdiction, and that their subjects, otherwise slaves, have a moral obligation to obey the arbitrary dictates, which they call laws, set by their masters. Simply put, a status believes in the legitimacy of slavery. Just to give it a little bit more depth, statism, the brilliant idea that we give a small group of people the right to abduct, imprison, harass, dispossess, and kill people, so we can be protected from people who will abduct, harass, dispossess, and kill people. So that's how it happens when you live in a domination structure. So that's this structure. This is what it will do to your belief system. Like, none of this is knowledge. This is all belief. That's what this is. And you'll hear it a lot, right? The most common way you'll hear it is when people say, but how else are we going to get anything done if we don't have a hierarchy? So this is people who have no other way to conceptualize working together, right? And so the camp kitchen in Canberra was a perfect example. There was no actual top-down structure there, and yet they were able to organize the most amazing meals. And for masses of people with variety, they even had vegan in there. So, you know, people don't see what's really there. They're just so used to the programming of there has to be a domination model. Otherwise, you know, there'll be chaos. That's what they fully believe, you know, but they got no evidence of any other type of model working to say that there is no other way to be. They just know what they know, and that's what they, you know, that's what they follow. And you'll also hear it like, yeah, we're not happy with how things are, but what are you going to do? That's just how life is. You know, that kind of stuff is being pushed into it. You know, what's the Malcolm Fraser, you know, one thing he was famous for, life wasn't meant to be easy. That's all part of that programming. You know, so you will accept your slavery. You will accept your chains. And so now I'm going to show the alternative model that we haven't had access to. I just got to bring up a new share, so just bear with me for a second. Actually, no, what I'll do is I'll go and elaborate on government, actually, because they did talk about that in the video. So, you know, government is based on the illusory and false concept called authority. So that doesn't actually exist, right? As someone who's the author of your life. Authority is the belief in certain people having rights to exert control over other people's lives, such as the right to compel, command, coerce, and constrain against their will. That's what we've allowed government to be, because we're missing that one fundamental thing, which is trial by jury. And because we're missing that, this is what we've come to accept. That's just what life is. That's just how it is. And you hear that. And this is this whole construct. This was a re-education program on purpose to get us to accept the unacceptable. This whole statement. The collective of people with special rights has become what we've come to know as government. So we've given them authority by believing there's no other way it could be done. And how did that happen? We were coached into it. Our parents taught us, their parents taught them. You know, it was very subtly done. And so most people just take it and accept it as there's no other way. They're not happy with it, right? Their gut instinct tells them this isn't okay, yet they're just incapable of envisioning any other way, or they're unwilling to envision any other way. So then this is what you get, and this is what we're living today. You get the police state, yeah? That's the manifested expression of the collective's internal belief in external rulership. That's what's the whole outcome right now, and that's why everything's going sideways for everyone, really, even the ones who believe this is true. It's still going sideways for them. They're still suffering. I speak to people who believe, you know, this whole COVID stuff, and they talk about their suffering. The only difference is they have no clues how to identify what the true source of it is. You know, they just because they're part of the collective, they think, well, that's just how it is. We're all suffering it together. So why am I better than anyone else? You know, they come up with these stories, and these are perfect control stories, right? And let me just bring up the slavery one. So here it talks about the Milgram experiment. Shows the effect of hierarchy structures have on decision making. Denial of responsibility for acting out of conscience is commonplace, where one believes they are subordinate to a superior. So if you want to think about what religion does, right, it creates the idea that there is a superior and inferior being. Superior one is the God, and we are the inferior ones who are never good enough. And so we're always looking for approval for that from that superior being. Same thing that happens when you have a bunch of guys with an alpha male, right? It's the same structure right there. Ask a police officer who bears the greater burden of responsibility, the one giving the orders or the one enforcing them, and see if you get an answer. So I've put that in other videos too as well, but this is another way just to reinforce that as to why these people in these costumes, you know, they believe they have some kind of authority, will go and listen to what their bosses tell them and act out of conscience. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen their reaction from their soul, and it's out of alignment with what they're actually doing, and you can see that they're uncomfortable with what they're doing. Yet they carry on, you know, and it's like what happened, you know, someone else is going to take responsibility for it. I'm not responsible, so that's good enough. So you know, that's where we're at. You know, that's the state of the consciousness of the collective at this moment in time, and has been for a very long time. Okay, so this is the one that most people are totally unconscious of, that actually has been in existence and can also, return into existence if they choose it. But yeah, the criminals that are in power at the moment, who are meant to be in service, but they've made sure they're in power, and made sure that we have no clues about this, and they'll do everything they can to discredit it with all the agents through their common law court groups that use versions of this, but they try and show it that it's all for nuffs and weirdos. So if we had this rule of law, for example, right, so the head of state is only equal to the people when they're a man or woman acting in their capacity, because they're not above the law. When they're in that office, they're not, they're answerable to the people. They are in charge of this structure here. So the way this structure is supposed to work is that the legislature can only make legislation, acts and statutes, bills, etc., that are to do with the role that the Constitution, so the Constitution is the law as set out by the people. So the rules, the customs and traditions that the people already live by and have lived by for centuries, they know what works and what doesn't, and they've set it out into a document. And then in that document was created the capacity for an artificial body called government, which is all this, by which they could actually have their needs for equity met. So it's like an organizational system to actually get the people's needs for equity met, right? So that's the infrastructure they require, the services, the labor organization, because the government doesn't do anything by itself. It's actually people acting as agents of government that do the labor, and also the resources. So we get our quality of life is equal to that of our neighbor, right? So there's a way that can be organized. That's all that legislation was designed to do. And then the head of state is there to make sure, because they're acting for the people, that any legislation is just and stays within the rule of law. So that is the 4 tenets. Doesn't breach any individual member of the community's capacity to access anything they require. So there's no loss caused to them, there's no harm, there's no breach of the peace, and there's no fraud committed against them. That's their job, is to make sure that they do that. And they have a contract that they take called the coronation oath, that binds them to make sure that they give assent to anything that's going to enhance the quality of life of the people they represent. And if it's not, they give it dissent, and if it gets past them, then we've got our fail-safe here, which is the people. And so that's how it's tested in the court de jure, the jury of 12, and there's a convener in that, no judge, right? And the convener's job is just to instruct the jury on matters of law. They take an oath, and part of that oath is to strike any legislation that was found unjust by the jury, to strike it off the statute books. They must do that. That's part of the oath they take, right? And then they control what these people do, right? So if there is any requirements for police to get involved, or prisons, that comes out of the people's choices, not this, that domination structure where there's a judge in there, and the judge is a lucratively paid employee of the government, deciding on matters of what is fair, as like who's going to work for someone and then say, oh, what their boss says is not fair. They're not going to do that, because they won't have a job if they do. So of course they're going to just rubber stamp everything that comes through from there, and that's their role, and that's not justice. That's a dictatorship. So that's just so to show you how it could work, right? So if you had a situation at work where things were happening that were unjust, you could take it here, right? And you could have it heard if there was some kind of loss or harm happening to you, right? This is how we would be in charge. So we are never, breached in those 4 tenets. That is sacred, right? That is not to be messed with, because to mess with ones is to mess with all. And so the rule of law, just more elaboration, means the law rules. It refers to the constitutional framework, and I explained what that was. It's agreement between the people and the holders of office, the sort of artificial body that's created, to cooperate under a system of equity and the rules necessary for equity to prevail. That's been set up in each country. Well, that's in theory it was meant to be set up, but in practice it's been subverted, and it's been inverted. So this is what we would have in our courts if we were having a legitimate justice system. That's the people's trinity. So the accused and the legislation on trial. If the accused is found innocent, then what happens is that the legislation now goes on trial, and then it gets deemed unjust. And that's how law is made, because the individual juror becomes the final arbiter of law. That's the annulment process then, when they strike it off the record, off the statute books. And then we have the last part, which is bringing those people who were acting in the service of the people, aka members of parliament, that were responsible for that bill that became legislation that was deemed unjust by the jury. They can now be brought before the people for under what's called common law private prosecution in their private and unlimited capacity, and they are tried as a man or woman for crimes against the people. And now you think about how that would change our understanding of government, right? You know, so what I showed you would never exist. And to finish off, if you want to, you know, have an understanding of what it means to be sovereign, you would need to know how to answer these 7 questions. And anyone else who claims that they're acting for your sovereignty, you need to have them answer them. So define what law is, define a constitution, who has the authority to write a constitution, what is a defining principle of democracy, what is a safeguard mechanism that protects the people's capacity for self-determination through self-governance by putting the people in charge of government. What does an act to constitute the Commonwealth of Australia mean? Define the difference between knowledge and belief. All right. So there you go, guys. I'm just reiterating stuff I've done before, just in a different way. And that's going to do it today.